O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and our Redeemer. Poor Hosea. We read just a portion of his story. He was a prophet called to speak for God just before Israel was overrun by Assyria. And through his very life, he was to demonstrate God's relationship to Israel. At God's direction, Hosea married a notorious prostitute named Gomer, and by her he had 3 children. A son named Jezreel, meaning, I will punish the house of Israel. A daughter named Lo-Ruhamah, meaning, I will no longer have pity on the house of Israel or forgive them. And finally, another son, Lo-Ami, meaning, you are not my people and I am not your God. Be thankful you didn't have Hosea and Gomer as your parents and have names like that. But through those names and through Hosea's relationship with Gomer, he was trying to demonstrate God's sense of relationship with Israel. After the 3rd child was born, Gomer runs off to continue plying her trade, abandoning both Hosea and her children. And Hosea searches for her. We find through the first 10 chapters of Hosea, this search for Gomer. Eventually he finds her. She has become enslaved. He buys her back out of slavery and reinstitutes her as his wife. And through these actions, Hosea is trying to portray Israel's relation to God. God had rescued Israel from slavery in Egypt. God had walked with them through the wilderness, through various attacks by enemies, through various trials and tribulations, through Israel's desertion of God for other gods and idols. God continued to love them. God was angry with their desertions. God knew that there would be consequences for the choices that they have made. For in those days, as today, if you make a wrong political alliance, there are consequences. And Israel unwisely chose to seek not God's direction, but direction from Egypt. And when Assyria conquered them, there were terrible consequences to pay. But this 11th chapter of Hosea, we get a very different and a very tender picture of God. It is as if God is reminiscing about his long history with Israel. Just as parents and grandparents look back at when children who are now grown were babies, so God is looking back at the covenant relationship that God and Israel have shared. In this 11th chapter, God pictures Israel as a baby one would lift up to a cheek, as a baby, as a young child that one would teach to walk. In the Message translation, those first verses read, when Israel was only a child, I loved him. When I called out, my son, called him out of Egypt. But then others called, and he ran off and left me. He worshipped popular gods, played at religion with toy gods. Still, I stuck with him. I led Ephraim. I rescued him from human bondage, but he never acknowledged my help, never admitted I was the one pulling his wagon, that I lifted him like a baby to my cheek, that I bent down to feed him. What a wonderfully human picture of God, pulling a child in a wagon or lifting a child up, just as Stephen lifted Nathaniel up, to care for them, to love them. Just as a young parent wants to hold the hand of a baby as it learns to walk, so God was and is walking with those whom God has called to be part of the family, to be as young sons and daughters, or as St. Paul wrote, to be heirs with God's own Son. Because of Jesus Christ, we too can be part of this picture, like that young child, so close to God that God will hold our hand, will walk with us the God will lift us up and hug us as Israel or Ephraim before us, holding us cheek to cheek, being that close, being God in our midst right with us. The imagery of God who would hold our hands as we learn to walk, of one who could get angry but one who would not destroy, of one who loved us so completely that every opportunity would be taken to bring us back into the family, became part of my meditation for the week. As our new brief statement of faith says, like a mother who will not forsake her nursing child, like a father who runs to welcome the prodigal home, God is faithful still. These loving, tender images of God are important. It is easy for many of us to see God only as angry, vengeful, judgmental, exacting justice, but without kindness, without love. And certainly there are passages in the Bible that support that view. But we must not forget this loving, tender passage. Not necessarily that God or Jesus is our best buddy, someone so totally familiar that we can sort of ignore them, but as one who loves us, one who wants the best for us. As I began thinking about this passage from Hosea, the poem Footprints came to mind, and I've printed a copy of that on the back side of the insert for your hymn. And this summer season, some of you are heading to the beach or have come back from the beach, and you are familiar with footprints in the sand. You know how clearly you can see your own footprints and those of someone who might be walking with you. And in the poem, a person talks about seeing two sets of footprints and then suddenly only one set. The person realizes that at the time they could see only one set of footprints were times of trouble and distress for them. They're angry at God for deserting them. And when asked, God answers the person, "It was then that I carried you." This fits the picture that the prophet Hosea gives us. God not only walks with us, but carries us in times of deep distress. We do not always know this. We are not always aware of God's presence. We do not always acknowledge that God is with us and that nothing can separate us from God's love. And yet God says that no matter what we do, no matter that we do or do not understand, God will remain faithful, especially in times of difficulty. A few years ago, I read an addition to this poem. An unknown author added that the footprints continued again side by side. And all of a sudden they became chaotic, with two sets of prints moving in and out, intertwined, so that you almost couldn't tell which set was which. And again, the person asks God, "What's going on?" And God said, "That is when we danced." This morning, we celebrate communion or the Lord's Supper. And yes, it is a serious occasion, but I don't believe we are to be somber. Jesus talked about a great banquet. During the service, when Pastor Mark and I stand behind the table, we are there to invite everyone to come to the feast, to join together around this banquet table. All who have been baptized, no matter when, under what, or in what denomination, are invited to join together. You know, and I know, that at a banquet there would be music, there would be dancing, as well as good food. People would be celebrating. People would enjoy one another's company. And that is the image that God has for us as we gather around this table.